Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Pretty Gritty Tours, another virtual tour experience. I, of course, am your tour guide tonight, Chris. If you don't know me, now you do. I am a former investigative journalist turned full-time tour guide operating here in South Sound region. And tonight, I'm going to introduce you to McNeil Island. And if you don't know McNeil Island, here's your opportunity. And I'm going to premise this whole thing with the fact that I am not a McNeil Island expert. There are McNeil Island experts out there, and I have drawn from their research. There is a ton of people to thank for this. In no particular order, but the Washington State History Museum has done a tremendous amount of research on this project, as well as Grit City Magazine, the Tacoma Public Library, Steve Dunkelberger, and then above all else tonight, I want to thank Larae Liddle, because Larae came to me some time ago with the idea of even doing this, and she had a unique angle on the whole project. And Larae has worked for quite some time with a group called Grave Concerns, which, if you don't know Grave Concerns, they started as a volunteer organization. They continue to be a volunteer organization, but their project was to work with the Western State mental hospital, essentially. And this is a picture of the cemetery out on McNeil. But if you don't know, the Western State Hospital had a patient cemetery from the early days of it opening as a mental health hospital or an insane asylum at the time. And the first almost 3,000 people that were buried out there were buried anonymously with just numbered markers, because at the time it was against the law to have an identity on these grave sites. And so Grave Concerns got together, they lobbied the Washington State legislator and got the law amended so that you could actually have the names listed there and you could have an identity to these people. And it was such a taboo thing over the years, because if someone died in one of these hospitals, these mental institutions, people didn't want the names to be out there because there was a stigma attached to it. But now, especially going through it with the modern lens, a lot of these people that died in this institution and were buried out there, you know, there's a whole variety of things. We could do a whole virtual experience on this topic alone. But, you know, from postpartum depression to syphilis, you could get incarcerated out here in this mental institution and then buried there anonymously. And so Grave Concerns worked tirelessly to bring identities to these people. And Larae Liddle was a big part of that research. And then she took it upon herself, with the help of a woman named Marissa, to go out and identify the 125 prisoners who were buried in the prisoner cemetery on McNeil. And we'll talk about the cemeteries that are out there. But a lot of the people that were buried on that island ended up getting exhumed and put onto different family plots, or they were reburied in different cemeteries. But the 125 people that remained out there did so anonymously until Larae went out and made sure that each of them had a name for eternity. And when she brought that research to me, I was like, okay, we're going to do a bunch on this. So over the next few days, we'll be trickling that out as well. But I wanted to introduce you guys to McNeil because I think not everybody knows about it. So here we go. Good to see you, Dan. Glad you're here. Mary, thank you. Thank you. Jessica's here. This is Larae's daughter. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you guys here. So yeah, let's start with the basics, shall we? What the heck is McNeil Island? Also, Larae Liddle did win a research award from the Heritage League of Pierce County. Kind of a big deal. There you go. So McNeil Island is this patch of land out in Puget Sound. It's the one circled in red, in case you're curious, just to the west of the sort of Tacoma Peninsula, Fox Island area. And here's a different view of it. This is McNeil Island out there. And McNeil originally goes back to the day where this beauty was cruising around. This is the SS Beaver. I don't know if you're familiar with this ship. It was part of what was called the Mosquito Fleet back in the day before roads or airplanes, the only way to get around Washington, like pre-statehood, was on the Mosquito Fleet, which is a swarthy gang of colorful captains and makeshift steamboats that went around ferrying people from place to place. And the Beaver was the first of the Mosquito Fleet, notorious for the fact that it was so not efficient. It had to essentially deforest every place that it went to have enough wood to generate steam. But in 1841, May 11th, to be specific, Lieutenant Wilkes came down on his sailing ship, the Porpoise, in southern Puget Sound near Fort Nisqually, and was visited by Alexander Caulfield Anderson, the post's chief trader, and William Henry McNeil, the captain of the company's steamship, pictured right here, the Beaver. And Lieutenant Wilkes was just overcome with the positive atmosphere that they created for him. They gave him such a warm welcome and offered him, quote, every assistance in their power, end quote. And so he named this island after McNeil. But like myself, he was not a great speller. And so he left out one of the L's. McNeil was with two L's at the end. And so he left it out, and that became the official name of the island. And eventually they dropped the possessive, leaving this as the island itself. And the first documented settlers on this bad boy were actually the Meekers. The Meeker family, most famous for being out in Puyallup, where they established themselves as the hop empire of the Pacific Northwest. Ezra Meeker was out first here, but here's the thing about McNeil. The pros and cons are it's isolated and it's isolated. So if you want to start a homestead and actually connect with people, it's a terrible place. If you want to create a prison, what do you know? Here are the seeds for the Alcatraz of Washington. And thus, Meeker got off the island and was like, okay, I'm done with this. Then, after the Meekers established their homestead across the area in Steilacoom, there were plans drafted up to create a territorial prison. And because the island had an abundance of materials and the right sort of soil for farming, and it was remote, being just 3 miles across Puget Sound by rowboat to Steilacoom, it became the spot where people were like, oh, shoot, should we do a prison here? And while I'm thanking people, if you guys really want to dig into this topic and get to know a lot more about it, I got to recommend the Forgotten Prison podcast. You can find this online. And this was part of that Washington State History Project to really dig into the whole thing. And so you can learn tons more on the podcast here. Tonight, we're taking a cursory view of McNeil Island and looking at the people that were buried out there, because it operated as a prison. That's the sum up of this whole thing. It operated as a prison for 136 years. And today, if you're not aware, it is a special commitment center for sexually violent predators. And as of 2000, this is the quote I've seen the most often, there were 268 residents at the facility. And these are people who are compulsive or violent sexual offenders who have served their term, but they're not deemed able to come back out into regular society. So they stay at the special commitment center, which is a lighter version. It's not a prison per se. It's got its special title and it differs in a lot of ways, but it's still there. So McNeil starts as this Meeker settlement, and then eventually becomes the territorial prison for Washington. And this is pre-statehood, right? So Washington becomes a state in 1889, and then this was the territorial prison out here. So this picture is not from those early days. This was in its sort of second development of really refurbishing the whole place. But McNeil has some distinctions, and one of them is being the only prison in the U.S. that started out as a territorial prison, became a federal penitentiary, and then eventually a state correction center. So it ran through the whole transition of government in the area, right? It was territorial, then it was federal, then it was state. Today it's still run by the state, but it's also the last prison in North America located on an island accessible only by boat. And if you're going to try and come at me with Rikers Island, remember that Rikers has a bridge. So McNeil is not connected by any way other than boat. That's how you get out there. Today, there is still a ferry that runs from Stilcombe out to McNeil, where the correctional officers commute on their day-to-day. And that's what it is out there, right? So I'm just checking to make sure. Yeah. So this is the thing. There is a 100-yard standoff section, right? Where it's illegal to go to this island now, unless you are occupying the special center out there or working there. But don't take your boat out there. They're going to zip out there and ask you to move along because they don't want people breaking out or people breaking in to break somebody out. It's still an active facility out there, so don't get crazy with it. Here we go. This is a picture from the early days. So this is in 1900. This is already after it had been established as a territorial prison for a while. But this is a view from the beach down there. And in the early days, a guy named Gilbert Palmer was the warden at this time. And he was in service out there from 1893 to 1900. And his residence was built right there on the hill north of the prison. And what you can see that they've done here is that they took the people that were incarcerated out here and made them work in these labor camps to actually produce the prison. So they were out there chopping down the trees, digging up, quarrying the stone, building these structures out there. And a lot of it had some famous architects involved. The whole Heath and Gove architects, who were really instrumental in the development of Tacoma across the board, they designed a lot of these facilities out there. And you can see the first penitentiary was this 3-story structure out there. And it was designed so that there were no cells facing the exterior walls or attached to the exterior wall to prevent escape. So essentially, they were in the middle, back to back. And then there was that space on the exterior there so that you could patrol or have your guards come up and down from there. And there'd be windows that would look in. But it was supposed to prevent escape. Of course, there were some flaws in this plan, most notably the roof. There are some accounts of people on the 3rd floor in their cells being able to escape actually through the ceiling of this facility and then giving people a run for their money, but eventually getting captured again. And here you go. This is, again, from 1900 when they went out with a photographer to capture what was going on. These are the early days with the chain gang out here on McNeil Island Prison, territorial prison at the time. And they were like working out here to create the prison that they were going to then occupy. And what's interesting about this, and the Washington State History Museum covers this a lot more, as well as the podcast, but the spectrum of crimes that would get you incarcerated out here has changed dramatically over the years. The vast majority of people that were sent to this prison were originally convicted of selling alcohol to Native Americans. That was like the main crime that would get you sent out here. And then over a few more years, I think the highest rated crime out here was forgery, followed by mutiny. And then later on in like the 1930s, you see a lot more gang violence, certainly like more mob related, bootlegging, things like that. And then there was a whole period where it was used for essentially incarceration of Japanese or NISA, Japanese Americans during the internment camps of the United States. There was a time where Cuban refugees were kept here as a detainment center. And then in the 1950s and 60s, there was also a lot of forgery and then violent crimes. You see more like manslaughter or murder showing up on the list of people who are put out here. Here's another one. This is the same one from a little bit earlier. And here's a look of the penitentiary on May 28th, 1875. And you can see how those structures were designed, built out of stone back there, and then try to keep them from reaching those exterior windows. And it began operation in 1875 when this guy, Marshall Kearney, arrived with the first 3 prisoners. His names were Abraham Gervais, who was 28, sentenced to 20 months for selling whiskey to Native Americans. Frank LaFontaise, 27, sentenced to 18 months for selling liquor to Native Americans. And John W. Hand, age 28, sentenced to 12 months for robbing a store at Fort Walla Walla. And then after they were put out there, they were kept in this little facility here. You can see this is staff member in the main office there on McNeil Island Penitentiary. I don't actually know which year this one came from, but it was early on. This is from 1900 as well. This is with Gilbert Palmer. He's the 3rd from the left there. He's that first warden we were talking about of the McNeil Island Penitentiary. And again, served from 1893 to 1900. And if I'm not mistaken, these men pictured here, these 7, were the entire staff for this area out there. And they were creating a facility that would become more self-sufficient. They were trying to harvest the materials from the island to build the prison and then create farmland to feed the prisoners. And this house right behind it, this house number 1, was completed in 1874 out of brick and stone. And I had, if I'm not mistaken, 48 double cells, which had, the whole grated flat iron doors, was in the middle of the cell block to prevent escape from the exterior. And then the prison behind is one of the guard houses. So the guards were quartered adjacent to this whole facility right here. Then in 1906, they added this structure out here. This is the first hospital built on McNeil, because still at this point, it was a mix. You had half an island of homesteaders, people that had still gone out there during the meeker days and settled the area and created homesteads on McNeil Island. And then you had the territorial penitentiary. And they occupied that same space for quite a period of time, not on the exact footprint, of course, but on the exact same island. They cohabitated. And as structure came out, it was usually mutually beneficial. So this in 1906, that first hospital was created for the penitentiary. And the story of McNeil in the early days is really one of neglect, right? The Attorney General was not super focused on this forgotten prison out here. And because it was out of the way to get to, it was difficult to supply, and there was no lines of communication. The only way to talk to this island was to take a boat out there. It was difficult to make improvements or to request improvements out there. So it wasn't until, a couple decades into this project that they had their first doctor out there and then built this structure. Now, unfortunately, this one is no longer out there. This was built in 1906, and then 2 decades later, it was razed to the ground, and then they built the new hospital in the 1930s. And the 1930s saw quite a bit of expansion out there on McNeil. So between 1906 and 1930, they built 3 additional cell houses. Cell house number 2, completed in 1911, and that had 66 double cells. Hey-o. Cell house number 3 completed a few years later in 1924, and that contained 50 8-man cells. And then cell house number 4 completed in 1930, the last of them there, and that contained 30 8-man cells. And so it was during this period that the penitentiary added an administration building, pictured here, a new hospital, an auditorium, kitchen, and dining hall. And by the 1930s, the penitentiary had approximately 1,000 inmates. Now, of the buildings that are still out there, this is from the McNeil Island Historical Society. We'll share their links. Go check them out. They have also a fabulous interactive map. So if you want to look on the exact locations where everything is on McNeil Island, the McNeil Island Historical Society is the place to go. You can find them right online, and they've got great stuff going on there. And this was a 1932 building. This was also done by Heathgrove and Bell, our famous architects out here. And this was built as the personal home for the McNeil Penitentiary's 5th warden, a guy named Finch Archer. and he was appointed in 1922. And so this building is one of the few that is still out there. And what's wild is the island has gone through these rolling phases of abandonment. In the 1930s, there was a big push to remove homesteaders from the island. And so some money changed hands, ownership of the island changed hands as well. And so these homesteaders were essentially forced off the island, told that they could sell their property, I think it was like for $50, or that the property would be essentially condemned and that it would be bought for $50 anyhow, so deal with it. And the majority of them ended up leaving with just whatever they could carry. And then years later, there was a larger push to push people off the island altogether. And the only people that were remaining were essentially people that were working there. So you had to be someone who was connected to the facility, a guard, in the staff somehow to stick around. And then eventually everyone was moved off the island entirely, except for, of course, the Special Commitment Center, which is there today. So if you were to go to the island, you could take a look at these buildings right now. Here's another perspective of the warden's house out there, and it still has a few items in it. What I thought was interesting is this. This concrete well was built by an inmate, a guy named Bill Rennick, and created this by hand, stained the concrete, created the fountain, the bench, and the bird bath at the warden's residence in 1935, I believe. And if you go, it is still out there. This picture was sent to me by someone who was on McNeil Island as part of the staff not that long ago. COVID time for me is very nebulous, but it was very relatively recent. Here's another view looking down towards the beach and shows that first cell house again, brick and stone structure, the adjoining guard quarters right there on the back, and a two-story frame building, which, if you care, a William E. Boone construction. And this was called the Auburn System prison plan, where the cell house is completely enclosed, and essentially you build a shell around your interior prison there. So let's see here. Thank you. This is one of the things, yes. Correctional officer is the official term there. Going through, I spent a lot of time getting ready for this one, just going through the Department of Corrections site, because they also have quite a few great historic photos from the whole thing there, as well as their timeline there. But they have very clear statements on everything. So thanks for coming along with me. And yes, I'm glad someone brought this up. The Washington State History Museum exhibit on this whole thing was amazing. And what I thought was really cool about it was that they designed the spaces to represent sort of the cell space that you would have encountered out there, right? So over the years, the cells changed pretty dramatically. I think I have a picture of it here. And so you can see they got larger over time. And so they did a nice job of representing the space there with that. And if you can see from this photograph here, that iron gate that was in front of the administration building here ended up in the collection. So it was on display at the History Museum when they did their special exhibit there. So here's a good one for you. This one shows you the map of McNeil in the early 1930s, showing the ownership of the land prior to the government taking possession in 1934. And again, look at all the different homesteaders out here on the fringe of that island. And you can see the road that runs sort of a whole loop around it here. And what happened is all of these people were out there originally. And then as that prison expanded and went to take ownership of it, you ended up with a lot of these abandoned structures. So from, I think it was in between 1925 and 1936, the government purchased all the privately owned land and the civilians moved off of the island. And then McNeil Island officially earned the title of the largest prison reservation in the United States, after the Bureau of Prisons appropriated additional funds to move the bodies of 86 pioneers off the island to cemeteries, to different family cemeteries, right? So 86 people who were homesteaders who had been buried on family plots on the island. end up getting exhumed on the Federal Prison Bureau's dime and moved anywhere else that these families wanted to see them go. But they left the prisoners. And that is a big part of where Larae comes in, because she went out and managed to identify, I believe, all 125 of them. And she's got a book, a digital book that I'll double check with her, but I think would be very, very easily shareable for everyone if you want to take a look at that, because it's a ton of people out there. And she even managed to track down additional information on a lot of them, like what their crime was and how they ended up meeting their end out there. In the late 70s, these are the abandoned structures out there, in case you're curious, by the way. In the late 70s, Washington State had a severe shortage of prison space and was under federal court order to take speedy action to correct the situation. So by 1979, the legislature became aware of the federal government plan to surplus McNeil Island and began to investigate the possibility of acquiring it, right? So there was a lot of debate kicked up over how best to use this island, because Washington State wanted to use the facility to, relieve overcrowding for Walla Walla at the time, which I believe was at capacity in the late 70s. And other state institutions could then sort of use this as a surplus space. And Governor Dixie Lee Ray, Tacoma native, graduate of Stadium High School, who was promoting a plan to build a new prison out in Monroe, was vehemently opposed to this idea and really saw McNeil reverting back to sort of a wildlife refuge. And so a lot of contention arose in the 1970s over what they were even going to do with this whole place. And it still had people living there. Families of these correctional officers or staff were still living on the island, and the future of McNeil was really up for grabs. And Dixie Lee Ray was arguing that, the island was beautiful as a nature reserve, so it should go back to that. And it was too expensive to use as a prison. So proposed that it be turned into a state park, but didn't happen. Especially because now there was a third party contending in the whole thing, which represented the original families of McNeil Island, who these homesteaders and their descendants that felt that the island should be returned to them if there wasn't going to be a prison out there. And so of these 500 people, I think, that were evicted from the island in 1936, a lot of them or their families really wanted to return back to what they saw as their ancestral land here. And they even threatened to take their fight up to Congress, but it never happened. So here's a picture from the 1950s, 1960s, sort of in that development phase there. Eventually, it transitions from a federal prison to a state facility. And this is kind of what you would see here. So this is from 1985. This is what it would have looked like up through the 1990s. And it's traced the whole line, right? Eventually, once the state prison got shuttered, when it was considered obsolete and, again, too expensive to maintain, it became that special center that's out there right now. The thing about McNeil is, it's like I was saying early on, right? The appeal of it is that it's an island, right? It's Washington's own Alcatraz. It's icy water. It would be near impossible to get from the island to the shore just by swimming. It's a dangerous path, and to take a boat becomes pretty obvious, especially in the early days. Like, your options were a steamboat or a rowboat, right? You weren't going to just necessarily jam around on a schooner or something without being super obvious. So it was easy to spot someone. There's even a great story of an inmate that escaped the early territorial prison there. He went through the roof, I believe, and then escaped on the island, somehow got a hold of a rowboat and took off. And the correctional officer at the time took off after him, managed to find him, and they had, I'm not going to call it a high-speed chase, but certainly an exciting chase. 2 rowboats going around Point Defiance before he was eventually captured and then returned back to the penitentiary. And why Why I've never seen the short film done at the Tacoma Film Festival of that chase taking place, I will never know. The challenge has been issued, my friends. I'd like to see it happen. Please make it. On the topic of rowboats, here's a great story I stumbled across where in August of 1926, these two young pioneers right here, this is Killian Schmermerhorn, I kid you not, Killian Schmermerhorn and Wilmot McCune spent a week rowing 80 nautical miles from Point Defiance to Olympia and back in this bad boy right here. This is a double-oared clinker that they rented from the park's boathouse. And basically, they took the Viking approach of staying close to shore and just went island hopping, camping all around Puget Sound, Olympia and back, and eventually got caught in a storm and capsized on McNeil. And they got found by the guards, who were instantly like, what is happening? Who are you here to break out? And are we going to have to shoot you? And eventually, because they're like, I think they were high school seniors at the time, right? They convinced the prison guards that they were not trying to break anyone out. And they became instant celebrities there. The guards fed them, clothed them, housed them in the guardhouse until the storm was over. And then they became local celebrities out here. This is from the Tacoma News Tribune, or maybe even the Ledger at this point. The story of these two guys. And look at them. True Huck Finn adventurers at their peak. And they're not the only ones who have broken onto the island. I need to be very clear with you guys right now how incredibly illegal it is to even get close to the island, let alone get on it. But you guys all have access to the internet. So I'm going to just remind you that if you're looking online, you're probably going to find this guy. Forbidden Island is a YouTube video. It's about 30 minutes long by a guy called Vagrant Holiday, who essentially takes a kayak and in a fog bank rows his way onto McNeil Island, stashes it in the bushes, waits till dark, and then just goes around through buildings like this. So this is the community center that was constructed here. It's one part chapel, one part rec center, one part school for the community out there. Here's a picture of it in the 1980s, I believe. And inside there's like a gym, a library, a kitchen. There's even a little bowling alley in there. And this guy, Vagrant Holiday, creeps around in the middle of the night going through all these buildings and spends about 30 minutes giving cheesy one-liners in true legend fashion, taking pictures of everything and filming the entire thing. Here he is in the bowling alley. He bowls like 3 frames before he goes on his adventure. He explores the basement of the rec center, which is, as you can see, completely flooded here. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. I watched the whole thing cover to cover. It was oh man, yeah. And that's the thing. I would love if the state would allow a video tour of the island. It's something that we have proposed in the past. But if you want to see the nighttime tour of it, Forbidden Island, it's worth watching. In fact, it was the McNeil Island Historical Society that recommended it to me. They sent me a Facebook message. They're like, "Have you seen it?" I was like, "Are you guys allowed to even be recommending that?" I don't know. But this is the school. So on the far wing of that building are classrooms. And remember, in the early days, pre-1936, this island was still heavily occupied by homesteaders. You saw that map, they were all around the edge there. So they needed a school for them, as well as the fact that after the 1935-36 eviction of McNeil Island happens, people needed a school for the children of the staff that was working there. So this is a picture from, I believe, 1953. Thank you, primary class of June, for writing it on the board for us here, showing you what these kids looked like out there in the 1950s. And that school is, as you can see, still out there today, just languishing. Oh man, no, I have not. But don't worry, Baba Booey, it's on the way. So let's talk about famous people that have been out on McNeil. One of the most notable names, of course, is Robert Stroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. And he was out here on McNeil for a manslaughter charge, I think back in 1906. And then eventually went to Leavenworth, not Leavenworth, Washington, Leavenworth, Kansas. Remind me to tell you the hilarious story of the time my mother-in-law ordered my wedding cupcakes from the wrong Leavenworth. That's a good one. But Mr. Stroud here at Birdman of Alcatraz ends up serving out his long term through federal prisons, eventually in Alcatraz, but advances the science of ornithology quite a bit, working with sparrows and pigeons that he captured while he was at prison. And then eventually a warden, wanting to make the prison look more like a rehabilitation facility, gave him tools and equipment to work with. And his study of birds and bird diseases ends up getting published in a book that gets smuggled out of the prison. It's a crazy story. Wikipedia at some time. But yeah, he was in at least 1906 out there on McNeil. Also, Charles Manson. And if you're not familiar with Charles Manson, I'm astounded. But yes, the enigmatic cult leader who ended up getting put in McNeil for check forgery, if I'm not mistaken, was there in the 1960s. And they have some wild photographs on I'm trying to remember which of the sites it's on. Here we go. The McNeil Island Correction Center from the Department of Corrections has photographs of the Manson cell. One is right here. That was notable because he crafted this pentagram on the floor in there, along with quite a bit of smokes for seasoning and color. So yeah, the Manson cell photographs are still there. Although it's worth noting, and you can back me up on this, vagrant traveler, the Manson cell is no longer there. The cell house that he was kept in, that cell block, I believe, has been demolished over time, and the Manson cell is now gone. And there are still quite a few of those original cells out there, including pieces of the original penitentiary, but parts of it have been changed and updated over time. Also, when we're talking about people that have been there for a variety of reasons, this is George Hirabayashi, born in 1918, died in 2012, and he was a remarkable sociologist and religious pacifist who reaches his fame based on this. He establishes a practice of resistance to all things in life, right? But he ends up getting incarcerated out here on McNeil because of his resistance to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. He was protesting the fact that these tests that were given to NISA, Japanese Americans who were in internment camps, were wildly unfair, in that they would ask questions that were just sort of standardized, like, do you renounce your fealty to the Japanese emperor? And people would be conflicted, right? Where they're like, well, I don't want to say yes, because that implies that I ever had a loyalty to the Japanese emperor, but I'm an American, so no, I don't. And then they would stay in an incarceration at an internment camp because they said that they weren't renouncing their fealty to the Japanese emperor. So this gentleman here was in vehement protest to that, so they put him in prison. And he ends up getting released, obviously. And I'm trying to think when his criminal conviction was overturned. I think it was 1987. It was late in the game, but he ends up receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 2012. And this is him when he was 24 years old, talking about his incarceration out there. Also, I stumbled across this one because there's a large period of time where I'm trying to remember the exact years that it was out there, but it was used as a detainment facility in the 1980s for citizens out of Cuba during the mass emigration out of Cuba, known as the Mariel Boat Lift. I think it was like 100,000 people that end up coming over from Cuba. And when some of these people were found to have had criminal backgrounds or mental health issues, they were kept in detainment facilities around the United States until someone could go through there and process their caseload and figure out what to do with them. So these are Cuban refugees out at McNeil watching television out here in the early 1980s. And you can see this one, I'm trying to remember what year this one is from, but the cells could be nice at times, right? And this was one that was particularly well decorated at the time, but a lot of the time they were pretty shady. So this is, well, we're looking at befores and after here. This is the 1930s, I believe, dining hall that was constructed, famous for this walkway up at the top there where the guards could walk over and observe everything that was going on. It is still there. This is a photo that comes from the site from the Department of Corrections. What it looks like now, basically just furniture storage, but it still has those iconic walkways up at the top. So here's the crown jewel, guys. This is the prisoners' cemetery. And originally, there were 21 prisoners buried in a separate cemetery that was right next to the main cell block. And they were removed in 1904 and reburied out here in the current prisoners' cemetery. And I'm trying to believe it was, let's see, 143 people buried out here. The first 125 graves were marked with numbers, and then there were at least 18 gravestones that had names, birth dates, and death dates. And this was up until 1972. And then in 1972, it was decided to bury prisoners off island. So these ones that are out here today are the ones that didn't have known families, or people didn't know how to contact them, or they just didn't have the money. And this one is located right here. So Hillcrest is the name of it. It is the inmate cemetery. And this is the one where Larae Liddle did the majority of that research. And I'm happy to share all of this on our social media later because it's phenomenal what she dug up. I don't know if that's the right term for this one here. What she discovered, let's say. But Levi Livingston, I believe, is the first person who was buried out there on the island. And she found an article about him out here. And he gets incarcerated for forgery, making fake silver $50, narrowly escapes the first time, and then ends up back out here at McNeil. And that first cemetery was much closer. So you can see sort of the white space here. This sort of demarks the area that's been used as penitentiary historically. And you can see where that first sort of prisoner cemetery used to be. But the one that's located right here with the red arrow is a special gravesite. So when the homesteaders were moved off of McNeil Island, they were all given the opportunity to have loved ones or family members exhumed from their family burial plots and then reburied somewhere else, anywhere that they chose. And only one of them remained, and it was a little boy. And I want to bring up his name here. The little boy, they didn't move him because he was surrounded by these 4 trees, and they were worried. Edwin William Holm, that they wouldn't be able to get him out because the roots would have been intertwined with his remains. And so he was born in 1895, died in 1896, was buried right then. And he is the only one of the homesteaders that remains in their original burial spot out there on McNeil Island. And everything that I've encountered about his story talks about how he is one of the most cherished and revered parts of that area there, where they never even considered exhuming him out there once they realized that the trees were going to create such a complication. You can go through these stories because they're absolutely amazing, and like there's just not enough time in a single virtual tour to go over all of them. So I'm going to share the book and the names that Larae came up with right at the end of this, and the links and the articles that came with it, talking about these guys who are out there, as well as I'm going to share with you guys a link to oldspirituals.com, where they've uncovered a lot of the mug shots from the very early days of McNeil. And here's a few of them here. This is Frank Doan and W.M. Hams, Atai and Lao Fan, both of which I believe were arrested just for being Chinese nationals in Washington State. I think anyone who knows me knows that I've talked about the Tacoma method, the Chinese expulsion and burning of Chinatown down on our waterfront down here. And then afterwards, there was legislation preventing you from even being a Chinese national in the area. And so a lot of these guys ended up out at McNeil Island. Almost every single one of these guys in this original mugshot here from, I think, 1904 was arrested for the crime of selling alcohol to Native Americans. And then these are the only two women that I've been able to find who were incarcerated out here on McNeil. And in the early days, they were not kept in the cells the same way that the men were. They had separate accommodation in sort of like the guard quarters areas. And I have not been able, this is Florence Harley and Maggie Snyder, and I have not been able to dig up what it is that got them incarcerated out there. But I am definitely going to share with you guys the document that Larae sent me of all of the names that she went through and found, and then the articles and the information about that, because it's expansive. And they're the legacy of this area in so many ways, right? Because McNeil has changed dramatically from a homestead island to a federal, well, to a territorial penitentiary, to a federal penitentiary, to a state prison, to the special commitment center. And then over the years, they went through all these different times where people left because it was isolated. Then they were forced off of the land by the federal government. Then they were kicked off again. And then eventually, I think in 2011, everyone was gone. And there's an article that I'll share with you guys as well, written by this woman who grew up on McNeil Island. Her father and her mother were both a part of the staff out there. And then when they were removed from their home, they were given one last opportunity to go back years later and look, and like everything was still in there because they just took what they wanted to and left quite a bit behind. So like toys, I think she uncovered her dollhouse still out there when she went back. And it's a really interesting perspective on that whole thing. So here's my encouragement for you guys. Go through this digital book that Larae put together, painstakingly giving dignity and names back to the forgotten dead. Go and listen to the podcast and get acquainted with the deeper history of this area and look into it a little bit more. If you're going to watch Vagrant Traveler, do it. Pour yourself a beer and go for it. That's what I did. But seriously, there's just so much to it. I wanted to introduce you guys to the island and talk a little bit about what's going on out there. And I'm just a huge fan of what Larae has done of going through, not just with McNeil, but also as part of Grave Concerns and going back out and giving names to the people from Western State Hospital that were buried out there anonymously. I think it's very noble work, and I'm proud to get to represent it a little bit tonight. So if you guys have questions, please let me know. If you don't, make some up. I always love answering questions, but a huge thank you again to Larae Liddle, to, of course, the Washington State History Museum, Tacoma Public Library, Grit City Magazine, and the McNeil Island Historical Society. You guys are out there keeping the stories alive, and I really appreciate it. To the rest of you, thanks for the interest and for coming out. I am encouraging you to go back out. Keep on exploring. I will talk to you guys soon. We got a lot of cool virtual content coming up, including our next Pretty Gritty Tours virtual ghost tour. And if you miss seeing my face in person, you can always come back out. We are now running all our in-person tours, including our tour of Stadium High School. You can find it all on prettygrittytours.com. I will see you guys soon. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I think I'm supposed to say that. Good night.